Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Now, as a member of the Clearview Academy basketball squad, Ben Mason knows this gives him a chance to prove to the rest of the school that he is worthy to be one of them. He plays with all his heart and tries to motivate his teammates to play their best as well. When they face their first contest with Corona School, Ben has the opportunity to show what he can do. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. The Winning Basket by Duane Yarnell. Chapter 8. A Visit from Harrigan. For a moment, Rod King looked at Ben, as if Ben were out of his mind. Finally, he said, "Don't you realize what you're letting yourself in for, Ben? Through no fault of your own, you got off to a bad start here at the academy. You need a few friends, and I'm proud to be one of them. Why should you ask me to leave you alone? Or is it that you're tired of seeing me?" Very deliberately, Ben tried to explain. "You see, Rod, you're the captain of the varsity. You have a big assignment ahead of you. It's important that you help give the school a championship team. Lassiter and Lard Adams are two important cogs in the basketball machine. If you start favoring me, or even being nice to me, there's going to be tension created on the team. Lard and Lassiter won't like it, not a bit of it. They'll slacken down, and then we'll lose a few games and be out of the race. Clearview can't afford to have a squad split wide in two. You either have to be my friend or the friend of the other squad members. You have a lot more to gain by playing it the way I suggest, and so does the school." They walked along in silence. Finally, Rod said, "I'm beginning to understand what you mean, Ben. You're thinking of the school, when a lot of others would be thinking about themselves. It's all the more remarkable when I know that the school hasn't given you the breaks you deserve. You really must have that intangible thing we call school spirit." "After all," Ben smiled, "I came here because I wanted to. It can't always be this tough. I like the idea of being a cadet, and I'm going to keep on liking it." Suddenly, a faraway look came into Ben's eyes. "Someday," he said softly, "someday I hope that things are different. That's why I'm willing to play it the hard way now." Darkness was closing in, and as they reached the dorm row, Rod paused outside his own entrance. "Well, Ben, I'm inclined to believe you're right. But I'm also warning you that you'll get terribly lonely until things start to break in your direction. Your best chance is to keep trying to make the varsity. As a basketball man, you'll be accepted. The fact that you're an orphan and a garage mechanic won't matter to the cadets then. You're moving into this dorm, and it'll even be tougher on you, living among upperclassmen, having to do as they command, not having anyone to talk to except me and a few other guys, when we can manage to have a few words in private." "I still think I'm all right," Ben said. Then, under the cover of darkness, Ben extended his hand to his friend. They shook, then they parted. A moment later, Ben was in the plebe dorm, rapidly assembling his personal belongings. He heard a step behind him, and when he turned, he saw Dave Monroe, the dorm guard. Monroe was scowling furiously from beneath beetled brows. "I heard about it," he said bitterly. "You think you're smart, don't you? Well, you're lucky, because if you'd stayed around here, you might have had plenty of extra work to do." "It seems to me," Ben said evenly, "that Lassiter will have to do his own dirty work now." Why, what are you talking about, Mason?" "Figure it out for yourself," Ben said. Maybe the walls have ears. Maybe they hear things when Lassiter calls on you after hours. Maybe the walls hear you planning to make it tough on me so that I won't make the basketball squad. Oh, don't look so surprised, Monroe. I know a lot of things that would surprise you if I wanted to tell them. Dave Monroe just stood there, looking amazed. The color began to ebb from his cheeks. He gave one startled look, then turned and fled from the room. For the present, at least, Ben knew he wouldn't have to bother with Monroe. It took Ben an hour to pack his things and get them transferred to the other dorm, where the basketball men lived. He ate some fresh fruit in his room instead of going to dinner. Later, he intended to go right to bed, as his injured back was still bothering him. But Ben was in for a surprise that night. He heard a knock. Answering it, he was surprised to see heavy-set, smiling-faced John Harrigan. He came inside, hand extended. "You're looking fit, Ben," John Harrigan exclaimed, "and you've got a real hand clasp. A boy with a grip like that should go places on the basketball team. Tell me, Ben, how are you getting along?" "I'm satisfied with the way things are going," Ben said. "I'm afraid I'm no great shakes as a basketball player, though." "Now, Ben, don't be so modest. I've just talked with Captain Craig, and he tells me that you play a fine game of ball. Of course, he doesn't expect anything out of you for a while, but by George, I do. A young man who can straighten out a snarl in the assembly line of an automobile plant can surely do a little thing like make the Clearview Academy basketball varsity. I'm counting on you before the season is over, Ben." For an instant, Ben felt like protesting, but in his heart he understood. John Harrigan was a man who commanded millions of dollars. He was able to buy with those dollars everything he desired. He had shown his faith in Ben by seeing to it that Ben got enrolled at the school. It was that same faith that made him so positive that Ben could succeed on the basketball court. Actually, Ben felt a bit uneasy at Harrigan's confidence, but it only made him wish to succeed all the more. "Very well, sir," Ben said. "I'll do my best not to disappoint you." Harrigan looked pleased. "What an honor it's going to be," he exclaimed. "Jack Lassiter and Ben Mason, both crack forwards on the same great team. And both of them boys of mine." "That would be nice," Ben admitted. Secretly, he actually felt that way. Ben would gladly have called off his feud with Lassiter, if Lassiter would hear of it. But such a thing was impossible. Lassiter had no use for Ben, as long as Ben threatened to topple Lassiter's plans. "I'm not taking off my coat," John Harrigan said, "because I'm not staying. Ben, get into some warmer things. I'm taking you home for a little visit. Jack's getting ready. He's going home with us." "But I can't leave, sir," Ben protested. "I have to be in by 10. Besides, I haven't permission to leave, and—" "Don't worry about all that. I've already seen Smathers, and he's assured me it's all right if you leave for a few hours. I'll have you back in plenty of time, so you won't have to break training." So it was that Jack Lassiter and Ben Mason found themselves as guests of their sponsor and benefactor. The elderly man led them into his spacious library, and after they were comfortably seated in chairs, he said, "I've brought you here for a reason, boys. I've been hearing rumors that you two don't hit it off any too well, and I'm asking you point blank, is it true? Ben, do you have anything against Jack Lassiter? Answer me that question." Ben made a truthful answer. "I haven't a thing against him, sir. In fact, I could easily consider him one of my friends." Ben looked over at Jack. If anything were said about their real relationship, Jack Lassiter would have to say it. "Tell me, Jack, what about you? Can you get along with Ben? Have you any reason not to like him, or is all of this I'm hearing just a lot of gossip that doesn't mean anything?" "Probably it's just gossip," Jack Lassiter said. "I haven't anything personally against Ben. Of course, we're both trying to make the basketball team, and as natural rivals on the court, we've tangled a lot. but otherwise I think he's all right." Ben was amazed. He was wondering how Lassiter was going to get out of that one, when Lassiter added, "Of course you know that I'm an upperclassman and he's a plebe. I can't associate with him for those reasons, but next year—" There was a faraway look in Lassiter's eyes, and Ben knew that he meant that next year he would do his best to see that Ben Mason was not around. "Fine, fine," Harrigan said enthusiastically. "I was hoping it would be that way. And now that we're all friends, let's talk about something more pleasant. We're going to play Corona. How does it look? Have we a chance of winning?" Ben Mason knew nothing of the relative strength of both teams, so he wisely kept quiet while Jack Lassiter did the explaining. "The rumor is that Corona's bringing a better team to play us than she had last year. If that's true, it doesn't look too good for us." Harrigan frowned thoughtfully. "It's funny," he said, "how I have all the money a man could possibly want. And yet I think I'd give most of it just to see you boys turn in a championship season. You can bet that I'll be in the cheering season when you lock horns with the opposition this year. Well, that's all I wanted to talk about. Of course, if you didn't have to go back to school, I'd be willing to talk basketball all evening." While the two were talking, Ben had quietly been looking about the wood-paneled walls. There were several pictures, and one especially caught Ben's eye. It was of a young soldier in uniform. Ben walked over, glanced at the picture. The man looking out at him had a friendly, youthful face, a strong, almost stubborn chin. Ben knew, even before Harrigan came up behind him, who it was. "My son," Harrigan said simply. "The one I lost in the war. He was a fine boy, Ben. You'd have liked him." Ben felt extremely uncomfortable. He said, Yes, I'm sure I would have. And now, if you don't mind, sir, I believe we should be going back to the academy. Training rules, you know." The squad went into intensive training for the Corona game, but Ben Mason played a minor part. His back was sore, and when he tried to run on the court, his muscles simply refused to function as his brain ordered. As a result, his play was slow, and it slowed down the entire game. The game was scheduled for Saturday. The squad scrimmaged every night, with Ben out of the lineup. Then on Friday, the evening before the game, the coach called them into a session on the court floor. "Men, you look ragged. For some reason you're not clicking. Ordinarily I'd let you rest tonight, but in this case I'm going to make you play. You need work, not rest. You're playing ragged ball. And as you are now, you haven't a chance of beating Corona. You first-team men act as if you think your positions are cinched. Well, they're not. Unless you snap out of it and play heads-up ball, you'll find yourself crowded out to make places for some of the second-team boys. Okay, now let's start it. The regular varsity and the regular second team." Ben had half expected that he might get a chance to play. Disappointed, he sat back, while the two teams locked in grim court battle. Captain Craig came over. "How's the back injury, Mason? Think you could play?" "You bet I can play," Ben said eagerly. "I'm glad to hear it. You need the practice. You go upstairs and run around the circular track a few times. When you get limbered up, come back. I'm going to send you in as a second team forward. Quick about it now." Ben went upstairs to the indoor track. Faithfully, he warmed his muscles by jogging about the track. After half a dozen laps, he felt new strength pour into his aching muscles. He began to feel he could hold up his end of any kind of game. Back to the court he went, and this time it was with a vow that he'd watch himself if it was the last thing he ever did. The varsity had the ball out of bounds when Ben went into the game. The scoreboard indicated the varsity was leading by 4 points. Lard Adams took the ball over the sideline. With 3 seconds allowed him to throw it into a teammate, he had little time to make up his mind. Every varsity man was guarded by a scrub. In desperation, Adams flung the ball toward Hal Chase. Ben leaped far to his right, and as the ball shot through the air, he managed to lay his hand on it. The move caught the varsity off guard. Ben was racing down the floor, was driving toward his basket before the disorganized varsity could go back on defense. But Jack Lassiter was a fast man, faster than Ben when Ben was dribbling and Lassiter was running. Ben heard a gasp behind him, and because Lassiter had been assigned to guard him, he guessed correctly that it was Lassiter who trailed him. Ben reached the basket, still a full step ahead of the man who dogged his footsteps. For an instant, Ben was tempted to leap, but he remembered what had happened once before when he had leaped for a goal with Jack Lassiter so close behind him. So instead of leaping, Ben stopped in his tracks, ducked down close to the floor, and leaned far out to the right. His move was so sudden that it caught Lassiter unprepared. Lassiter had already begun to leap. He sailed far over Ben, then lit sprawling on the floor beneath the basket. As for Ben, he calmly straightened, then shoved the ball through the hoop for a clean score. "That's the old way to play it, Mason," the coach shouted from the bench. "That's using your head for something besides a hat rack. The rest of you men take note of that play. When you get into a crack, use it. It's much better to pivot away from a man who comes charging in at you than it is to stand up and let him plow into you. Remember that." Ben Mason was secretly elated at the coach's praise, but it was apparent the rest of the squad didn't like it any too well. Most of them regarded Ben as if he were an impostor, and in his heart he secretly vowed to make them change their minds about him before the season was over. Chapter 9. A Visit from Corona. The cadets' gymnasium was filled with a capacity crowd, and customers had been turned away. 10 minutes before the preliminary game between the two second teams, the school band broke into the stirring, familiar Academy song, "Onward, Clearview." The very rafters of the building seemed to vibrate with the throbbing tones of brass and drums. And down underneath the seats, in the large dressing room occupied by the home team, Ben Mason was getting that peculiar frightened feeling that comes to every athlete when he hears the music of his school, the school he is about to go out and represent. Ben didn't believe that he would get to play. However, he was a member of the team, and although he didn't get to play, they couldn't take that single thrill away from him. Then came the tense feeling as the coach said, "We're the underdogs tonight, men, in both games. You have a school out there that is willing to go with you all the way. 2,000 persons are waiting to see how well you can acquit yourselves. You know the starting lineups. All right, get out there. Give this game everything you have. Someone has to lose, but if it's you, I want you to go down fighting. That is all." The coach opened the door, and then, in a single file, the red and white-clad warriors raced out on the floor. Instantly, the cadet cheering section stood up and apparently went wild. The band, not to be outdone, doubled in volume, until it seemed that only the spirit of Clearview kept the roof from caving in. Suddenly, a hush fell over the gymnasium. Looking around, Ben understood the reason. The Corona men had taken the floor. Corona, wearing neat-looking black uniforms, was indeed a sight that would silence any crowd. Their men were tall and rangy-looking. They went at their warm-up drill like a band of veterans. There was confidence in their every move, and it was easy to see that they were out to win this game and start their way toward another successful season. At last the warning whistle blew, and the two squads withdrew from the court. The cadet varsity took seats on the bench, but the coach called the second squad off into a corner. "The same lineup we've been using," he said. "Cardigan and Mace at the forward spots. Whalen, take center. Blue, you and Holt will hold down the guard berths. I needn't tell you men that you're fighting for a chance to play on the varsity. Those of you who show up well in this game will have an opportunity later on to play varsity ball. So you see, You have a lot more at stake than just winning this ball game. You know how I've taught you to play. The rest is up to you. Get in there and fight every minute. Good luck to you." Ben followed the coach to the bench, deciding that the only way to enjoy the game would be to sit back and forget his own personal problems. Ben did just that. When the tap came, he was leaning forward as eagerly as if he were one of the players on the court. The taller Corona center controlled the jump. The ball was tapped to a shifty-hipped Corona forward. Corona passed with a speed that was dazzling. Swiftly they worked the ball down into scoring territory. A Corona guard took a bounce pass at the free throw line and immediately flipped the ball toward the hoop. It cut through the netting with a swish. The scorekeeper put a large 2 beneath Corona's name, and the few rooters who had made the long trip from Corona went wild. But the cadets' seconds were not whipped. The quick Corona score only served to steady them. Taking the ball beneath the Corona basket, Blue tossed it into Holt, who held down the other guard post for the cadets. The cadets began to advance the ball on short, zipping passes. Across the center line they sped, carrying the fight deep into enemy territory. Whalen, in possession of the ball for the cadets, sent a looping shot from the corner of the court. It went through the hoop without touching metal. The fans were delirious with joy, and the score was then Corona 2, Clearview 2. The Corona quintet, realizing they had more of a scrap on their hands than they had anticipated, worked the ball down the court more cautiously. They made their passes sure, for they knew that as long as they retained possession of the ball, the other team couldn't score. Cardigan tried to get possession of the ball for the cadets, but in his eagerness he slapped the arm of a Corona man. The referee called holding, and the Corona man took the ball into the free circle. From the free throw line, he took careful, deliberate aim. The ball left his fingers, arched gently, then plunked into the net for a score, and Corona was in front, 3-2. Corona scored next on a lucky one-handed shot by their star scrub forward and went into a lead of 5-2. But the lead was short-lived. The cadets came back with a vengeance, and after working the ball in close, Cardigan scored to bring the count up to within 1 point of a tie. Then on the very next play, the cadets intercepted a Corona pass, and their stellar guard, Blue, shot from the center line and scored. The stands went wild as the cadets moved into the 6-5 lead. Immediately the cheerleaders rushed out and gave 9 long rahs for Blue, the player who had given them the lead for the first time during the game. On the bench, Ben Mason heard that cheer. It caused his eyes to go suddenly misty. A lump came into his throat, and had anyone asked him a question at that moment, he would have been unable to talk, so deep was his emotion. How long, he wondered, would it be before the gymnasium rang with the cheers of his name? Would he ever hear his name like that? The half ended with Corona leading the cadet section by a lone point, 21-20. The fans had come to see a ball game, and now they were seeing a regular court classic instead. As the 2 tired quintets left the floor for the halftime intermission, the crowd stood and cheered lustily. Suddenly, however, over the clamor of that basketball-mad throng, Ben Mason heard his name called. Looking up at the row of boxes, he saw John Harrigan. Ben quickly looked at his coach, and Captain Craig nodded that it would be all right for Ben to have a word with Harrigan. "Hello," Ben said as he walked up to the box. "How are you enjoying the game, sir? It's a real one, isn't it?" "I'm on the verge of apoplexy," Harrigan admitted, grinning fondly at Ben. "I've never seen a varsity game that would match this one for thrills. There's only one thing worrying me, Ben. When am I going to see you in there?" "I hope," Ben said fervently, "that I'll be in there during this next half. I'd really like to get a chance at Corona." Don't blame you, my boy," John Harrigan said. But his tone warned Ben that he would be sorely disappointed if Ben didn't make an appearance in the game. Ben nodded, then made his way to the dressing room. There he found Captain Craig in earnest discussion with his seconds. "You fellows are playing fine ball," he was saying to them. "But during the next half you're going to have to play even better if you expect to win. Corona has always been known as a second-half team. They're stronger at the finish than they are at the beginning. Rest as much as you can now and be ready to go out there for the real fight in the second half." The second half opened swiftly, and then one of those curious things happened. A basketball team can function like a perfectly oiled machine for 1 minute, and the next, it can fall to pieces. That was what happened to the cadets. When they would get the ball, they couldn't handle it. Expert passers like Cardigan and Mace were suddenly all thumbs. They tossed the ball around like beginners, and every time they got it they fumbled, and Corona frequently recovered. Expert shooters like Whalen and Blue of the cadet seconds were suddenly unable to find the correct range. Time and again, Blue stood back in the middle of the court and fired away at the hoop. But the ball would only bounce off the rim of the basket after coming close to rolling in. It was heartbreaking for the cadets, and even more so for the fans. Instead of a ball game in the second half, they were seeing a walk-away, and it was in favor of the other team. The score mounted minute by minute. At the end of the third quarter, the Corona crew was in front, 34-23. Mason, come here a minute. Get out of that warm-up suit and get into the game." At the coach's cry, Ben Mason was on his feet. There was no time to congratulate himself on his good fortune. Ben stripped out of his heavy warm-up suit and raced to the timekeeper's bench. He had heard the coach's order, and now he reported. "Mason in at forward for Mace," he said. The timer blew his horn, and Ben hurried out onto the floor, where again he reported to the referee. Mace went out, and Ben took his place at left forward. The ball went in play, the ball being thrown in by Corona under the Clearview basket. Everything seemed hopeless for the cadets, and the way they were playing, it looked as if they realized it. Corona took the ball and drove again toward the basket, but a long shot failed, went out of bounds. The official signaled for the cadets to throw it into play, but Ben asked Holt, the cadet captain, to call timeout. When this was done, the players sank down upon the floor in utter dejection. As for Ben, he eyed them disdainfully. "Maybe you fellows wonder why I called a timeout," he said slowly. "Well, it won't take me long to tell you why. During that first half you were in the game and played bang-up basketball. But when you started going behind, you decided it wasn't worth the effort. You thought you were beaten, so you curled up and quit. All I can say is that you sure must be proud of yourselves. How are you going to face the rest of the school when Monday comes around, and they ask you what happened?" Ben faced them in hostility, and they returned his glares. Finally, it was Cardigan who said, "You may be able to tell someone how to run a garage, but this is a basketball court, and there's a lot of difference. We're up against a better team than we happen to be. If you think you can outplay these guys as hot as they are, go ahead and do it." "Maybe," Ben said grimly. "I'll do just that." It was Holt who threw the ball in for Clearview. Holt, remembering Ben's words, tossed the ball to Ben with a show of disdain that Ben didn't miss. His shrug as much as said, "Well, you said you could do something with it. You've got the ball now. What are you waiting for?" Ben knew it was up to him. His leap carried him half a step ahead of the man guarding him. That half step was advantage enough. Ben saw a clear aisle right down the middle of the court. Furiously he began to dribble, and as the ball banged against the polished oak floor, it gave off the staccato crack of machine gun bullets. Across the center line he sped, the entire Corona team in mad, hot pursuit. Ben's injury was forgotten. Everything, in fact, was forgotten except the basket, which loomed ahead. This time, instead of faking, Ben drove straight at the basket. His arm flashed up with the ball balanced delicately on the tips of his right fingers. As he shot, the Corona man trailing him crashed into him. They went out of bounds together, but not before Ben had made the points. "That's a foul!" the referee shouted after blowing his whistle. "You held the man while he was shooting. Take a free throw, Clearview." Ben eyed the basket as he braced his toes against the free throw line. The whole thing seemed hopeless. It hardly seemed to matter to anyone whether he made the free throw or not. The rooting section was as still as a forest before a storm, and already the fans were adopting the attitude that even though the first game was lost, there was still the one between the varsity teams that would follow later. But Ben Mason was not quitting, not even if his team was hopelessly out of it. Carefully he took aim. He brought the ball up in an easy looping motion. It sliced through the net cords, and another point was added to the slim cadet total. The scoreboard now read Corona 34, Clearview 26. Less than 7 minutes of play remained. 7 minutes and 8 points behind. Corona came back with a vengeance. Once again they drove deep into cadet territory. Their teamwork was as precise as the workings of a Swiss watch. Every cog functioned perfectly, and there were no errors. When the Corona 5 gave evidence they were not going to give up the ball, Ben Mason took things into his own hands. He went out after it. He rushed the guard in possession of the ball, rushed him so that he had to pass swiftly, and the fact that he hurried made him commit an error. Cardigan intercepted the pass, and when he was immediately covered, he pivoted around and bounced past to Whalen, the cadet's second-string center. Whalen advanced the ball a few dribbles, but his guard soon caught him and smothered him like a blanket. Whalen saw, out of the corner of his eye, that Ben was breaking away from his own man, so he heaved desperately. Ben was crossing the center line when he took the pass. A corner of the court was open, and he dribbled furiously in that direction. The Corona guards in the meantime had drifted in behind Ben and were standing in front of the basket when he reached the corner and swung around. Ben took in the situation at a glance. With no one open and no one making an effort to get open, there was only one thing to do. Ben took aim. Then he let the ball fly in a long, desperate attempt from the corner. The ball crashed into the rim, bounded straight up into the air, and then fell down through the hoop for another 2 points. That put the score up to 34-28, and for the first time since the last quarter started, the stands began to take interest again. As for Corona, they were temporarily unnerved at the sudden spurt of the home team. For the first time that half, they grew nervous, and again the cadets intercepted a pass. With the stands pleading for another score, Cardigan made a long attempt from the center of the court. The ball bounced off the backboard and fell away from the basket, but Ben Mason, playing with the odds in his favor, took a chance that worked. He left his regular zone and leaped for the ball. His fingers touched it, and he held it but a moment. However, a moment was long enough for Ben to tap the ball through the hoop. The fans were delirious as the score was changed again. Visitors 34, Clearview 30. But the visitors were not quitting. The next time they brought the ball down, it was with their same steady, precision-like confidence. Slowly and deliberately they passed back and forth until they saw an opening. They thought they had their scoring chance, and suddenly their play speeded up. The visiting right forward broke sharply in toward the basket. He took a pass and leaped for it. Ben Mason was behind him, as was Cardigan. Cardigan and Ben leaped together. Cardigan missed the man altogether. Ben failed to get the ball, and his hand hit the Corona man's arm. The shot was deflected and went wild, but the sharp-eyed official saw Ben's offense. "That's a personal foul on you," he shouted. "Take 2 free throws, Corona." Ben felt desperately low about the foul, but he couldn't have helped it. He knew that the man would have made 2 points had he let him alone. Still, it was tough, standing there with his own team behind and only minutes remaining. It was tougher when the sharpshooting Corona man made his first attempt, for Ben Mason felt the responsibility for the point. However, the second shot was missed, and the visitors were leading by only 5 points. Somehow that gave the cadets a new lease on life. Instead of leaving it all to Ben, they suddenly perked up. The next time they gained possession of the ball, they worked it in close, and it was Whalen who made the shot count for a basket. Then, before the Corona quintet could get organized, they fumbled the ball, and Holt recovered under his own basket. He sent a dazzling one-handed shot through the netting, and the count was Corona 35, Clearview 34. At that moment, the cadets called timeout. During that timeout period, as they lay there upon the floor, the Cadet 5 heard the frantic pleas of the fans. The game had once again developed into a thrill-packed melee, and every spectator was sitting on the edge of his seat. As for the Clearview band, it was blaring forth the stirring songs of the Academy, tunes that brought lumps of emotion into the throats of every cadet who listened. And down on the floor, a tiny knot of men who refused to be defeated were talking it over. It was Whalen who said, "Mason, you took care of your end all right. Even if we lose this one, I want to tell you that you showed us up for what we are. Swelled up idiots. We've only got a few seconds. Let's all work together and see what happens." Holt called to the referee, "How much time?" In a moment, the referee came back with the jolting news. 15 seconds. Holt, facing his mate, said, "Corona gets to bring the ball into play. They can stall 15 seconds unless we fight for possession of the ball. The minute they toss in, we'll have to rush them. It's our only chance to score a win." 5 tired, desperate young cadets went back to their positions. The visitors cagily waited until the last moment before throwing the ball into play. Precious seconds elapsed while the cadets rushed their opponents. Ben had been in the thick of it. All thought of keeping with his man had been forgotten in the desperate gamble to get possession of the ball. But suddenly he heard a shout behind him. Turning, his heart fairly froze in his throat at what he saw. The man he had been guarding was racing madly toward his own goal, and was right then shouting for the ball. He was far out in front, and if he got the ball, a score couldn't be prevented. Ben leaped into action. He felt a twinge of pain in his still sore back, but in the heat of the battle, it was as unimportant as if a fly had alighted on him. All he could think of was the man he had let slip behind him. Madly he raced down the court. He heard a cry of warning from the lips of the fans gathered there. Instinctively, he realized the ball had been thrown. He had no time to look for it. But when he saw the Corona man break to his right, as if to catch the ball, he dived that way himself. Dived to his right and upward. Never in his life had Ben Mason called upon his body to respond as he did at that moment. Every muscle, every atom of strength that he possessed went into that leap. And then came the nerve-shattered reward as the ball slapped against his fingers. For an instant he juggled the ball, but only for an instant. Pulling it down, he pivoted. It seemed then that the entire gymnasium was a wild roar of sound, but over the tumult, Ben heard the frantic cry from Cardigan, "Shoot, Mason, shoot!" Even then, Ben had barely reached the center of the court, but he knew that the gun would go off at any split second. One glance at the basket, one silent, hopeful prayer on his lips, and the ball left his fingers. At that instant, the gun crashed resoundingly. The ball was still in the air, and although the time had elapsed, the game could not be officially ended until the ball came down. Ben Mason knew that, and knowing it only made the seconds more agonizing. The ball arched high, so high that it looked as if it would hit the rafters, and then it began to descend, swiftly, and yet so slowly that it seemed as if everyone must go mad from the suspense. And then the ball was down, through the hoop, crashing into the netting with a sweet swishing sound that sent a cascade of joy through the entire auditorium. It was a score! The final count was Clearview 36, Corona 35. And then the cheerleaders were shouting, and the crowd was behind them, shouting things that made Ben Mason feel prickly with gooseflesh. Rah, 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 Mason! Rah, 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 Mason! Mason, 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 they shouted. And Ben Mason, happy, bewildered, felt himself being led from the floor by his coach. Once inside the dressing room, Captain Craig said, "Ben, that was the kind of ball I want to see from you during the rest of the season. I saw faults in your play, but they'll be ironed out before long. Now I'm asking you if you would like to sit on the bench during the first team game." "Oh, I would," said Ben tremulously. "Okay. As for the rest of you fellows on the seconds, get dressed in your regular clothes, and then go up into the stands and watch the game. Pay particular attention to the way both teams work their offensive and defensive formations. That's all now. You're on your own until Monday." Ben Mason actually hoped that his good showing in the opening game would be enough to get him a chance to play with the varsity. But Ben was wrong. From the very beginning, the Corona varsity made it evident they were after revenge for the first beating. Exhibiting a smooth, polished brand of ball, they immediately jumped into a first-period lead. At the end of the period, Corona was leading 10-5. At the half, after a series of dazzling under-the-basket plays, the visitors jumped the score to 26-13. They were maintaining a doubled score, but as the minutes waned, the cadets were going farther and farther behind. During the half, Ben listened as the coach tried to analyze the mistakes of his boys. "I can't understand it," he said. "You all have the ability. You play individually like champs. But as a team, there's something lacking. Lassiter, you've scored 9 of our points. On offense, you look like $1 million. But on defense, you're terrible. You let your man get behind you time and time again. Snap out of it. That goes not only for Lassiter, but for all of you." But the team simply couldn't seem to function that night. They played even more dismally during the third period. It wasn't until the final period that they even began to resemble a polished basketball team. For 5 minutes of that period, they got a warm streak and poured through basket after basket. But the heavy damage was done, and when the game ended, the score was Corona 53, Clearview 37. It was a crushing, staggering defeat. It sadly deflated the championship ideas of the cadets. When the game was over, the crowd filed out silently, as if they believed it would be another year before the cadets could possibly win a championship. Chapter 10. Good Luck Strikes. Tuesday at practice, the coach threw a bombshell on the court when he said, "I'm here to produce a basketball team. It seems that so far I've failed pretty miserably. Today I'm making a flat announcement that will affect every member of the entire basketball squad. That goes for varsity and scrub men alike. Effective at once, no varsity position is safe. I'm forgetting entirely that I ever had a starting lineup. We're going to have scrimmage sessions every day this week. As soon as I find a starting combination that's effective, that's going to be the varsity. That may sound tough to you lads who thought you had your varsity berth cinched, but to you scrubs, it should provide an incentive to fight. All right, we're going to start scrimmaging in the same old way, only on the second squad, I want to see Ben Mason in the forward berth with Cardigan." That was Ben's first surprise. He had been in a substitute role, and now he was being jumped to the regular second team. But he knew, of course, that unless he produced, Coach Craig would yank him out of there at once. The ball was put into play with Rod King and Whalen jumping at the center circle. King, as usual, out-jumped Whalen, and the ball was deflected back in deep court to Lard Adams. The seconds went back on defense, and the varsity, or what had once been the varsity, quickly worked the ball down beyond the center line. Ben was guarding Lassiter, trying to keep him from getting the ball. But the fleet Lassiter drew Ben out of position, then took a pass and began to dribble furiously toward the basket. Ben, however, pulled back into the zone of play with a swiftness that surprised even himself. In 2 strides, he was dogging Lassiter closely. As Lassiter leapt for the basket, Ben leaped with him, stretching, straining every muscle. Ben managed to get his fingers on the ball. He batted it down, and the referee called for a jump between them because of the locked ball. As Ben jumped against Lassiter, he was ready for the feel of an elbow against his side or a knee against his groin. When it didn't come, when he had actually managed to out-jump Lassiter without injury to himself, Ben suddenly got an idea. He decided that Lassiter had injured him once, and that Lassiter didn't dare try it again, at least not until the memory of that first injury to Ben had faded. If this was true, then Ben realized he could play his best without having to worry about what would happen to him with his back turned. Of course, if he was wrong in his supposition, then... But being practical, Ben didn't stop to consider that angle. When he jumped with Lassiter, he managed to tap the ball to his mate, Cardigan. Swiftly then he raced down the floor, took up his regular position in the corner of the court, while his own guards were slowly bringing the ball down the floor. Holt, the second-string right guard, fired the ball into the free-throw circle where Whalen was waiting. Whalen was tied up tight by Rod King, so he could do nothing but pass back to Holt. Holt dribbled around until he decided Cardigan was going to break away. Cardigan was racing toward the basket, a step ahead of his man. He caught the ball just as he went under the basket. With no opportunity to hit the hoop himself, he leaned out, handed the ball to Ben, who was cutting in from the other side. Ben stopped in his tracks, while Lassiter went sailing over him, and then he straightened and pushed the ball up over the edge of the rim. First blood for the underdogs. But Ben got very little applause from his mates, and it didn't take him long to understand why. Against the Corona seconds, the game had been tight all the way, and Ben had managed to spark the team to a win. In the hysteria of the moment, his mates had been willing to forget that Ben didn't belong to their crowd. They had applauded him because they were so glad to be playing with him on a winning team. But over the weekend, they had had sufficient time to remember that Ben was not one of them. So once again they had reverted to their usual selves. The varsity brought the ball into play underneath the seconds basket. This time, they were out for revenge. The entire team swept down the court like a pounding ocean wave. The ball zipped back and forth between them like a thing alive, from King to Lassiter to Adams to Brown. The passing was zippy, faultless. But so was the guarding of the other team. Unable to work the ball in close, the varsity decided to gamble on a long one. The shot came from near the center of the court. It arched high, then began to drop. Ben saw that it was going to be short of its mark. Leaping high into the air, he reached the ball, drew it down from the melee of outstretched hands that had also reached for it. For an instant, there was a clear space of but a few feet. Ben dived into it, dribbling like mad. Through the space he bolted, just in time to have it close in behind him. There was a certain beauty in the way he dribbled toward the enemy goal, a beauty that came of clean living and conscientious training. With the entire varsity in mad pursuit, Ben sped down the boards. He passed under the goal, and as he did so, he flipped the sphere into the hoop for as beautiful a goal as you could ask for. Following that shot, there came a sharp, furious blast from the coach's whistle. Captain Craig came out onto the floor. "Lassiter," he shouted, "that's the second straight time you've let your man get away from you. I don't care how valuable you are on offense. If you can't hold your own on defense, you aren't worthy of a spot on the varsity. From now on, you're playing on the seconds until you prove you've learned something about defensive basketball. Cardigan, you're moving up to the varsity. Let that be a warning to the rest of you men. If you can't produce, make way for someone who can. All right now, get out there and go at it again. Let's see some action." It felt rather peculiar to Ben to be playing alongside Jack Lassiter, particularly as teammates on the second team. But if it felt peculiar to Ben, how must it have felt to Lassiter? Lassiter had always been a first-team player. Now his face was crimson as he went from the varsity to the second team. There was a dark scowl on his countenance that somehow managed to warm Ben's heart. It was amusing seeing Lassiter bothered about something, but Lassiter couldn't see the amusement in it. When the varsity brought the ball into play, Lassiter went crashing into the play like a blind bull. So eager was he to get the ball that he knocked 2 players to the floor. The referee's whistle pierced the gym's calm. "Foul on you, Lassiter," the referee called. Some of the scrubs tittered, and Lassiter's face blazed. He was playing his new role very badly. The varsity man missed his free throw, but in the scramble, Cardigan got the ball and pushed it through for a varsity score. On the bench, Captain Craig was mumbling to himself, and Lassiter, looking in his direction, didn't have to ask why. 3 baskets had been made, and each of them had been made off Lassiter. For the rest of that period, it was a nip-and-tuck battle between the opposing quintets. When the period ended, the score was 12-11 in favor of the scrubs. During the 1-minute rest period, Lassiter drew Ben Mason aside. "Listen, Mason," he said tersely, "I don't know how you like it down here on the second team, but as for me, I think it's lousy. There's only one way for me to get back up to varsity. That's to play good basketball. A forward can't do that by himself. He has to have help. And that's where you come in. If you think you can play terrible and keep me down here, you've got another thing coming. If I think you aren't playing your best, I'll poke you in the nose so quick it'll make your head swim. From now on, you and I have got to click. Get it?" Ben was amused. Playing together was the only way he had ever wanted to play, but it wouldn't hurt to let Lassiter believe he had considered differently. "Okay," Ben said softly, "you and I are playing together, but mister, you'd better run fast, because you'll have to keep up with me. I'm after a berth on that varsity myself." And so it was that Ben Mason and Jack Lassiter, rivals and enemies, found themselves in a spot where it was beneficial to each of them to play his best. During the second quarter, Ben and Lassiter had to get used to each other. It was hard for Ben to attune himself to receiving passes that were so swift and hard they came like bullets. As for Lassiter, it was difficult for him to get used to Ben's unbeatable accuracy. Brown, Lassiter's partner on the varsity, had been erratic, but when Ben passed, the ball was exactly in the right spot. While they were getting onto each other's style of play, the second team suffered a relapse in the scoring department. The half ended with the varsity out in front, 26-18. But the second half started differently. From the moment the ball was tossed up at center, it was evident there would be a dogfight during the rest of the contest. The scrubs got possession of the ball. Lassiter took the tap from Whalen, then began to drive toward the basket. When Lassiter was stopped outside the free throw circle, he pivoted, shot the ball to Ben, who was a step ahead of Cardigan. Ben faked a shot at the hoop, and when Cardigan continued to guard him closely, Ben whirled and bounced a pass to Lassiter. Lassiter was ready this time. He lifted the ball into the air, and it deflected off the backboard and into the net. "Just a minute," the coach shouted from the bench. The game was stopped, and Captain Craig walked out onto the floor. He looked at Ben, then at Lassiter. "That's the kind of teamwork I've been looking for," he said. Then to Lassiter, "Some more playing like that, and you might find yourself on the varsity again." As for Ben, the coach paid little attention to him. Practice that day ended with the scrubs coming along strong. Afterward, when Ben went to his room to prepare for supper, he heard a knock at the door. Opening it, he was a trifle surprised to see Rod King. Rod came inside and sat on the foot of his bed. "I just wanted to tell you," he said, "that I like the way you're holding up your end. You're up against tremendous odds, Ben, but by fighting, you can cut those odds down. Today you played good basketball. Lassiter, of course, outshone you because he's the flashier player. But I noticed you didn't let your man score as much as Lassiter did. The coach is a bit slow to recognize good defensive play, but if you keep it up, he's bound to notice you before the season's over." Ben was more interested in something else at the moment. "Tell me," he said slowly, "what the team is saying about me. Are they still mad because I'm a member of the squad? You needn't try to keep it from me. I'll find out anyway. You may as well tell me and get it over with." Rod King looked disgruntled. "I hate to admit it, Ben, but some very nice guys are making fools of themselves. They're really not high-hat, those players. It's just that they have wrong ideas. They were told by Lassiter that you tried to cut in on him, particularly with John Harrigan. They've been laboring under wrong impressions so long it's hard for them to change. They'd really like to be friendly with you, but they won't break down for fear the others will laugh at them." Ben digested that, then said, "At least I proved to them that I had enough stuff to make the squad. That counts for something. They'll never be able to take that away from me." "Well, I shouldn't be seen in here," Rod said. "I'll leave, but remember what I told you. Keep your chin up." Ben did just that. He kept his chin up and his eyes open. But there was no reason for him to worry about Lassiter, it seemed. Lassiter was too busy getting back into the coach's good graces to bother about watching Ben. The natural result was that Lassiter began to flash some of his old-time form. In the last scrimmage before the game with Bronson College, Lassiter and Ben clicked like two men who had always played together. For the first time in a week, the coach was smiling when he addressed his men. After looking at their expectant faces, he said, "Today you played as you should have been playing all season. Lassiter, you've improved wonderfully. I'm putting you back on the varsity. Cardigan, you take your place on the seconds again. You're a good man, but it'll take another year of seasoning before you'll be first-team caliber. Now there's one more change that's going to be made. Mason, you're moving up to the varsity. You proved all this week that you could play alongside Lassiter. The two of you should make a rip-snorting pair. I think today that for the first time this season, I'm safe in predicting that the Clearview cadets are going to surprise a lot of basketball followers all over the state. My scouts have watched Navy Prep play, and the reports are that Navy Prep has a chance of beating Corona. If that happens and then we're able to beat Navy Prep, that will give us a tie for the lead. But to get up among the championship contenders, we'll have to play basketball every minute of the time. That's all now. Take your showers and get on back to your dorms. Be sure to get plenty of sleep tonight, and be at the gym at 4 tomorrow afternoon. The bus will be waiting to take us to Bronson. Whatever you do, stay off your feet as much as possible. The bus ride will be strain enough on you." For just a moment in the shower, Rod King got a chance to congratulate Ben. But Ben had a certain idea that no amount of congratulations could shake. Quietly, he said, "Yes, I'm on the varsity now. You're willing to help me, and so is Hal Chase. But on the other side, there's Lard and Lassiter. They want Brown in my place. They'll try to see that I lose out. I don't mind for myself so much, but there's always the team to think about. A split on the club is too much to carry when you're trying to win. Will Lard and Lassiter play with me on the team? Play their best, I mean? Rod King looked thoughtful. I wish I could answer that, he said heavily, but unfortunately, I'm not a mind reader. This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to The Winning Basket. You can find a link to our podcast on the Marshall Public Library webpage, www.marshallpl.org. I'll talk to you again soon.